As the world increasingly embraces digital technologies, the issue of how to tax the digital economy has become a pressing concern for policymakers, particularly in developing economies such as Africa. The challenges are often associated with adopting tax policies that support their economic development goals. No doubt, a clear understanding of the operations of the digital economy is vital for the economic development of the continent. However, the proposed solutions to tax the digital economy by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and G20 may not effectively address the revenue, investment, and growth concerns of these economies. So on this segment of the show, Taxing Africa, which is in collaboration with the West African Tax Administration Forum, we want to examine viable ways and policies that are needed for the taxation of the digital economy by Africa. So for this conversation, I have Abdul Muheet CHOWDHARY, who is joining me from Lusaka, Zambia. He is a senior program officer and leads the South Center Tax Initiative. Thank you so much, Abdul Muheet, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be on this show.
And it's nice to have you too. So how does the digital economy operate and how important is it for Africa's economic development?
As of this year, the e-commerce market for Africa is expected to be around $36.5 billion, which is really a huge amount. And by 2027, it's expected to reach around 60 billion. So it's going to increase quite significantly. And the number of e-commerce market users are going to increase to around 607 million by 2027. And the growth rates are like really fast. So we see that the e-commerce market in Africa is enormous. But then when we compare it to the global situation, if you look at the data for 2019, Africa had 631 online marketplaces, but the total traffic for these made up less than 10% of the traffic on Amazon.com. So there is a big difference and there is a lot of space to grow. And here there are two aspects. One is that the future jobs, the future economic growth is going to come from the digital economy. We see all of us use apps, mobile apps, online websites for various goods and services. And this is going to increase. And there is, of course, the tax aspect where Africa requires its share of tax revenue from this. But at the same time, the tax aspect is also important to provide a level playing field for African companies to grow. Because when companies like Amazon and Google and so on are not paying their fair share of taxes to Africa, that gives them an advantage against small African companies which are trying to come up and compete. So not only is this depriving Africa of much needed revenues which are needed for development, but at the same time, it is also leading to an unlevel playing field, which makes it difficult for African giants and tech giants to come up in the future. So from both these perspectives, taxing the digital economy is really very important for Africa and its future.
All right, so we see that different institutions have come up with different tax solutions to taxing the digital economy. And some have said that the OECD G20 tax solutions being preferred are limiting when it comes to addressing issues of revenue, investments, and growth concerns of Africa. So I'd like you to explain how that is.
Yeah, I would just like to quickly say that my organization, the South Center, is an intergovernmental think tank of developing countries with 55 member states, 25 of which are from Africa. So we are really committed to supporting African countries in their growth and development. And because of that, we did a study on how much money will come for African countries from the OECD solution and contrasted that with how much African countries would get from the United Nations solution. We did this study in partnership with the African Union, with the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa. And I will first just share some numbers of how much each African, some sample African countries will get, and then talk about the details of the solution. So according to our study, which you can find on the South Center's website, the 54 African Union member states from the OECD solution for taxing the digital economy will get maximum $500 million in 2020. That was the finding of our study. Whereas from the United Nations alternative solution, which is called Article 12B of the UN Model Tax Convention, they could get up to 3 times, which is $1.4 billion for the 54 African Union member states. I would just point out that the UN Article 12B results can also be seen as a substitute for digital service taxes. So with that, I'm just going to read out some data for individual African countries. Nigeria can get maximum 91 million from the OECD solution, but from digital service taxes, it can get 371 million, more than 3 times. For Kenya, it is 25 million from the OECD solution versus 75 million from digital service taxes. For Tanzania, it's 16 million from the OECD solution versus 72 million from digital service taxes. And Ghana is 14 million from the OECD solution versus 100 million. That's the difference, 100 million from digital service taxes. So we can see that in terms of the data, the OECD solution is really going to give a very small amount of money to African countries. And this is not surprising because the OECD is basically the organization of the developed countries. It is meant to further the interests of its member states, which are all the richest countries in the world, 38 of the richest countries in the world. And this solution has been dominated by the United States, which has wanted to minimize the taxes on its tech giants like Google and Facebook and so on, who are really the targets of this tax. Now, why is it that the OECD solution is going to give such a small amount of money to African countries? It is the OECD solution is called Amount A. So the scope is very small. It would apply to less than 100 companies, around 70 or so companies, and to a very small percentage of their profits, only 25% of their residual profits, which is calculated on a certain basis, which I'm happy to get into later, is what will be taxable and shared with the entire developing world. So this is the reason why this solution is going to give such a small amount of money. And I would also say two things. One is that this is a very complex solution, and any country which agrees to this solution basically has to give up the tax policy right on all the companies which are not covered by the solution. So, as I said, this solution will only cover less than 100 companies, but if a country agrees to it, they will have to give up their taxing sovereignty on all the digital companies, not just these 100 companies. And the time for making this decision is going to come very quickly, because in July, the OECD wants to release their solution and give it to countries to consider. And by December, countries will have to make a decision whether they want to sign it or not. So it is really very important that African parliaments, African people, African governments analyze this solution very carefully, look at the revenue data, see whether it is helpful for their country, and contrast it, most importantly, with alternative solutions like digital service taxes or Article 12B of the United Nations Model Tax Convention.
All right, so you've wrote out a lot of statistics, and that can only come by the way of research and study. So I'd like to understand what the role of research and analytical evidence can play in the adoption of suitable tax reform measures for Africa, because we know that when it comes to data, Africa could be a bit deficient in that regards. So how important is it to make do with research materials and, of course, analytical evidences to see how we can drive up and, of course, adopt the kind of tax measures that are needed for the African business market?
This is absolutely important because a good decision must be an informed decision, and this requires data. And right now, as mentioned, the most important data which is needed is what are our policy options for taxing the digital economy, how much revenue is expected from each option, and equally important is how administratively feasible is each option given the capacities of the country, and accordingly, what would be a fair decision for each country. Here, the role of organizations in Africa like the West African Tax Administration Forum, the African Tax Administration Forum becomes very important because they can really work with tax administrations, academic institutions, research organizations in Africa to coordinate the research which is needed, because this is a very complex exercise. And of course, from our side, the South Center, we are always available to support African countries in these research and analysis.
All right, so finally, between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 provisions, which one would you say is more cumbersome and apt in fitting into Africa's narrative when we talk about harnessing domestic revenue mobilization?
As mentioned, Pillar 1 is going to really give a very small amount of revenue for Africa when contrasted with alternatives. And another thing to mention about Pillar 1, which is the solution for taxing the digital economy, is that pillar one is a redistribution of taxing rights. So only if the countries where the tech giants are based, like the United States and France and so on, only if they agree to give up their taxing rights, can those taxing rights be redistributed to market jurisdictions like Africa and other developing countries. So even if African countries agree to pillar one, that doesn't guarantee it will work, because it requires the headquarters of the tech giants like the United States mainly to give up its taxing rights. So in that sense, pillar one is definitely something which at a minimum we should see whether the United States and the European Union countries will accept it themselves, and only then should African countries make a decision whether or not to implement it. Pillar two, on the other hand, the global minimum tax is essentially suitable for tax havens and headquarter countries of the tech companies, because this is going to help you collect a minimum amount of 15% of tax only if that profit is declared in the country. But if the profit is not declared in the country, then there will be nothing to tax. 15% of a zero tax base will still be zero in tax collected. So even pillar two, the global minimum tax of the OECD, is not really recommended. So between the two pillars, neither of them is, I would say, really recommended for Africa. But there are many other alternative solutions which Africa has to tackle the same problems, to collect digital taxes and collect a minimum tax. And I'm happy to talk about that.
All right, probably in our subsequent shows, you will be able to talk about what alternatives are there in terms of tax solutions for Africa. Thank you so much, Abdul, for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, African countries can benefit more from taxing the digital economy, but this entails strengthening their tax systems, investing in research and analytical evidence, just as Muheet has said, and building capacities that help accelerate the implementation of tax reforms for economic growth and development, and that will be apt and suitable for Africa's tax administrations. That is the end of Business Edge for today. You can follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can also head on to our websites, www.newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. The conversation will continue tomorrow at 11 a.m. West African time. And at the top of the hour, the news will be coming your way as well, so you don't want to change the dial. My name is Lekan Onabanjo. Enjoy the rest of your day.